Hello, this is Elena Antonucci, and this is my final presentation on fentanyl trafficking into the US and how it is a unique blend of both a foreign policy and a domestic policy issue in America. Firstly, I want to define a few key terms that are important to understanding fentanyl trafficking. First, fentanyl is a synthetic opioid drug that is up to 50 times stronger than heroin and is now the leading cause of overdose deaths in America. Second, precursor chemicals refer to the chemical ingredients used to produce fentanyl. Third, when I mention cartels, I'm referring to criminal organizations in Mexico, such as the Sinaloa cartel. Next, ports of entry are official border checkpoints where most trafficked fentanyl actually enters the US. And finally, harm reduction refers to public health strategies that aim to prevent overdose deaths. Getting into the history of smuggling. In the past 10 years, fentanyl smuggling into the United States has progressed as production, in reaction to regulation, has shifted across borders. Most of the illicit fentanyl was shipped directly from China to the US through international mail systems during the early 2010s, enabling a small but potent amount to bypass detection. Once China put strict controls on fentanyl and substances in 2019, these trafficking networks adapted their methods by shipping precursor chemicals to Mexico instead of sending finished fentanyl. The large scale manufacturing of fentanyl began based on precursor chemicals mostly sourced from China, and it is being smuggled across the US Mexico border, mainly hidden in passenger vehicles and commercial cargo by Mexican cartels. Today, the overwhelming majority of illicit fentanyl entering the United States is made in Mexico with Chinese chemicals, and most seizures are made at official ports of entry, where these smuggling operations run directly through legal trade routes. So, some statistics are that in the United States, fentanyl has become the deadliest drug in modern history. The CDC reports that in 2023, about 105,000 Americans died from drug overdoses, and nearly 80,000 of those deaths involved opioids. Synthetic opioids like fentanyl are now the number one driver of overdose fatalities, pushing national rates from under 9 deaths per 100,000 in 2003 to more than 32 per 100,000 in 2022. Another national analysis shows that roughly 72,000 Americans died specifically from fentanyl overdoses in 2023. That's nearly 200 people dying every single day. These numbers illustrate not just a drug problem, but a nationwide public health emergency that affects families, communities, and the entire care system in America. These numbers also show why fentanyl has become one of the most urgent policy challenges in the US today. Now, looking at the major stakeholders in the fentanyl crisis, several groups are directly impacted by the policies surrounding fentanyl trafficking. On the US side, agencies like the DEA, Homeland Security, and Customs and Border Protection are responsible for detecting and intercepting fentanyl. Foreign governments, especially Mexico and China, are also key stakeholders because of the precursor chemicals from China and the cartels in Mexico that manufacture and traffic the drug. American communities and families are some of the most affected stakeholders, facing rising overdose deaths and public health challenges. The healthcare system and first responders also carry a major burden, from emergency responses to long-term treatment costs. Meanwhile, Mexican cartels remain central stakeholders as well, because fentanyl is one of their most profitable exports. When we consider whether policies help or hinder individuals, strong enforcement can save lives, but it may also strain diplomatic relationships or shift cartel tactics. The economic cost of the opioid crisis was estimated at 1.5 trillion in 2020, according to the US Council of Economic Advisors, showing how expensive and widespread the issue has become. Legally, fentanyl trafficking is a federal crime, but effective enforcement requires international cooperation and shared laws. In terms of efficiency, current policies still struggle to detect fentanyl at ports of entry because of its small size and high potency. Economically, the crisis harms U.S. communities while generating enormous profits for cartels, which creates a clear imbalance in who benefits versus who suffers. Proponents argue that both sides of fentanyl policy demonstrate the need for far stronger enforcement measures in the US. These include expanding screening technology at points of entry, increasing the number of inspections of commercial vehicles, and imposing tougher penalties on traffickers. They also believe that the US should pressure China into more rigorous controls of precursor chemicals, and Mexico to crack down on manufacturing labs. On the other hand, opponents argue that the US cannot treat this crisis solely as a law enforcement issue. They emphasize that focusing only on the border ignores the root cause, which is domestic demand for opioids. Some go as far as to say that criminalizing addiction leads only to worse health outcomes and overcrowded prisons rather than meaningful solutions. Others say expanding treatment, harm reduction strategies, and mental health support is far more effective in lowering deaths. Opponents also warn that aggressive sanctions on Mexico or China could damage diplomatic relationships and make future cooperation harder. Moving on to my opinion. The fact that the fentanyl epidemic has become what it has in America is a failure alone. As provided by the USA Facts organization, over 72,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses in 2023. That statistic is from almost 3 years ago at this point, and I'm sure those numbers have only risen. Besides an obvious failure on CBP's part as to allowing fentanyl into the US, the federal government is doing little to fix the mess. Innocent Americans continue to perish from their addictions caused by our foreign adversaries. Current policies in place have done little to help the problem, but are now especially useless as cartels continue to adapt their smuggling tactics. I chose this topic to highlight how this is still affecting Americans today, even though it is not a new problem. This plague reaches every state, city, and community in the US. In my eyes, it's almost a form of terrorism as the line between foreign and domestic policy is blurred here. We need strong governmental action to rectify the foreign aspect of this problem, as well as the little resources for already addicted Americans. Finally, some future solutions. Fentanyl trafficking is a global supply chain problem, and it's clear that enforcement alone hasn't been enough to slow the crisis. The United States needs a more comprehensive strategy because the issue involves Chinese precursor suppliers, Mexican cartels, and domestic addiction. Beyond our borders, we need to ramp up cooperation with Mexico to go after production labs and trafficking networks. We also need to push China to regulate companies exporting precursor chemicals. Simultaneously, inside the US, expanding treatment, mental health services, and harm reduction efforts such as Narcan access will drive down demand and save lives. Better scanning technology at ports of entry can also help block fentanyl before it reaches US communities. With the proper responses, both domestic and foreign, we can reduce demand, deaths, and illegal smuggling. Thank you.